So, good evening. It has been almost 7 weeks or so since I made the last video. And the primary reason why I decided to make another video today was a report in the Pravda that Putin had spoken at the National Convention of the Russian Industrialists and Entrepreneurs. And he made some interesting remarks there, and I will elaborate a little bit about those remarks and why they are important and what we can sort of conclude for the moment out of it, in which way Russia is going to go, or the Russian Federation, and how they assess the entire overall situation there with the ongoing war. And then in the second segment, we're going to talk a little bit about the ongoing war and the late advances here we had. But the bigger issue at hand is the capabilities of either side to disrupt the supply lines of the other side. That is by far more critical at this point of the war, at that stage. And the Russians have taken some area. One German high-ranking military commander assessed it for about 300 square kilometers, which is, he compared it with the size of the city of Leipzig, which may tell you something or may not tell you something. It is not a huge landmass, it is a landmass, and it is, like I've been saying, it's a give and take in this entire thing, but we're going to go to that in a minute. Before I'm going to get started here, I wanted to explain something, is because I posted a video from National Geographic's, the educational series, I think from 1985, 86, somewhere around there, from Bad Taberts. And there was a reason behind it that I posted this on my channel. We have some family members. It was the younger brother of my great-grandfather with his wife and their 4 children, the 4 girls they had, who had moved there from Kamenz, which today is Kamieniec-Sapkowicki in Poland, which is in Lower Silesia. So they had moved to Bad Taberts, and one of the daughters winded up marrying the Prince of Hesse, who lives over in the town just over on the other side of the hill there, just a few miles west of there. What was Helleshausen? It's the town of Helleshausen. There, his family had owned there a small castle, and he was there. So that was the reason why I put this up, was because that was the area where they lived in, and their house is still standing. It is not in a good condition. No one really knows who owns the building, but they haven't done anything with it. It is referred to sort of ironically and sarcastically in reference to the Prince Albrecht Palais in Berlin, which no longer stands, which was Heydrich's office, which he had rented from my great-great-granduncle, or great-granduncle, I think. It was my grandfather's uncle he had rented the palace from. And that building in Bad Taberts, or that house, that villa, was referred to as the Princess Palace for the 4 girls. So just that you know, but that's just to explain that, of why I posted that video up. We still haven't found the second reel of it. I don't know if there was a second reel. The thing was, that film was produced by Peter von Zahn, which was a German journalist, and he got paid probably by National Geographic Educational Foundation for that. It was like a commissioned work, and for whatever reason they picked butt belts they did, that's what the result is, basically. Now, let me get back to this, what Putin said. At the convention there of the industrialists and entrepreneurs. And let me give you a background here for a second. Back in, when I came to America, I was here for about a year or so, 2 years. I went to Pace University in New York City. Pace is a private college. And it was, for many decades, it was a college for accountants where you can get your CPA, Certified Professional Accountant. That's what that stands for. But they also had added a law school, a business school, and that sort of stuff. So that was already a bigger, much bigger college by the time I got there. And they had a nursing school, and they were getting into the medical field as they were located in Lower Manhattan with their campus right next to the downtown hospital. And so I started to enroll there, and I took international business management. That was my classes in law. So I got into this for about 2 years or so. I did that. I never graduated from it, but I learned a lot of stuff there, and very interesting stuff. And at the same time, I had an office on 42nd Street between 6th and Broadway, or 6th and Times Square, actually, in Manhattan. And I was doing business consulting and management services back then already, when I was young and beautiful and I had full hair. There's not much left. But I had an office there, and it was nice. And we were in the middle of it. And I would take the NOR train down from 42nd Street, right there on the corner, 6th Avenue. And I would go down to City Hall and get off, and I would be at college. And so I was pretty involved with all of this stuff. And a big thing in the 1980s and 90s, at that point in the early 90s, was what we referred to as M&A in the business world, merger and acquisition. And this was before anyone really started talking about supply lines and globalization and that sort of stuff. We weren't there yet at that point. We talked about merger and acquisition, and with it comes what we call consolidation. So I want to give you an example. In a country like the United States, you have two tire makers. Both of them make car tires, and both are publicly traded on the stock exchange, and on one side, one company decides to buy the other side. Now, in a completely free market system, you can go ahead and do this, where you have no regulatory environment or limitations in terms of size and monopolies that would be questioned by the government usually. In this case, we can go ahead and do this, so we merge these two tire factories together. One plant, is in Dayton, Ohio, and the other plant is somewhere in Denver, Colorado. Now we have two tire plants, but we need only one because the demand for tires is just not that great, and both facilities are not fully utilized. They're underutilized. There's equipment costs, operational costs, so we merge these two together. We're going to say, well, what are we going to do? We're going to keep Denver, Colorado, because it is cheaper. The labor is lower down there. So we're going to close Ohio out and consolidate it. And then the same thing is we have two corporate headquarters for both corporations. We have now merged. We have one stock. So what we're doing is we're merging the accounting offices. We're merging the sales offices. All of the stuff is merged together. And then you can reduce the overall number of employees, and your profits are going to go up and all of that stuff. This is the traditional merger and acquisition job, which a CEO or CFO in combination then with the board of directors usually engages, and sometimes you just invest some money to have an interest in another company, and then sometimes you have to take over the entire company. Then by the mid-90s, when Clinton was in office for, say, like 2 or 3 years, the China deal came about. And so what we had now was the merger and acquisitions kind of slowed somewhat down during that period of time. But now what we did is we entered into a phase where we were seeking joint ventures with a Chinese partner to get into the Chinese market. So you would buy into the joint venture as an American company, and so you didn't retain full control over it, but you had a stake in it, and technology would be transferred, and machine equipment was transferred. So say like we now engaged with a Chinese manufacturer of tires. The Chinese can make the tires at a tenth of a dollar, at 10 cents on the dollar, in than what we can do now in Denver, Colorado. So what we're going to do is we're going to farm out the low-end tires, the cheap tires, the $20 tire, the $30 tire, the $50 tire retail. And we have them started making in China. And here we make only the big tires, the expensive tires for trucks, mining equipment, and that sort of stuff, the real heavy stuff, for airplane tires and that sort of stuff. So we're going to reduce this. So now we're getting rid of even more employees here. And we're getting now our tires made at a fraction of the cost what it has cost so far. But we're not really lowering the price here. We are just reaping in the profits. And this is basically how this whole story started. And this was kind of envisioned by the Davos Forum with that German-Swiss fellow who there's in charge. And he heavily lobbied Putin and Medvedev since 2000. They have both been there several times at that and explained these things in detail on how this works. Now you have to remember the Soviet Union, the communists, had also a doctrine incorporated into their system is that certain items should only be manufactured in one place. So the Soviet Union would build in one place tractors for all of the communist countries around the globe and supply all of the brother states with Russian-made tractors, for instance, just as an example. East Germany would build a particular machine, whatever machine that may be, and supply all of the... So that was the kind of concept. Rather than having multiple national economies, what we normally call them, they were divided. You kind of combine all of the forces together, and then you locate the most suitable place for that particular product you need to manufacture. Now, in this case, China is one of the few countries which has a complete national economy because they can produce everything from the most trivial consumer items, to their military equipment and space technology for their use as a government. So they're really the only remaining country which has that capability. We have food production here in the United States, military production, space production, and automotive to a certain extent with delivery of parts from foreign countries all over the world. But we don't have a true national economy anymore. Neither does Russia. It never really got to this point because they were so used to this concept of not having a national economy where the country can produce everything and anything it needs and then in surplus of it and export it. That is the ideal situation. We don't have any of this anymore. Now, what Putin said was exactly of what the globalists wanted to hear. He said, if I'm going to read this now correctly, he said it is pointless and unnecessary to establish to build or produce everything in Russia. And this is what they needed to hear. And this is where the whole globalization conglomerate altogether, this is what they wanted to hear. This is what they needed to hear. So he's not going to close off and build everything in Russia. It's not going to happen. So he's going to buy the Chinese stuff, and they're going to operate the way they have been operating probably since the mid-90s, or at least since the 2000s. Europe is probably to a certain part out, but it is not really that relevant because it is primarily luxury articles which come out of Europe, out of Western Europe. France, Germany, Italy is all that luxury stuff and food items for the better part, and probably some of it is going to make its way in there. The diapers are going to come out of China. The diapers come out of China. There's no more domestic production anywhere in the world. China makes diapers for every baby on this planet, basically. If you buy diapers, they're Chinese made. There's just nowhere diapers left anymore. Not one country can make diapers except China. It's just the way it is. So he emphasized that indicates now two things. With that one statement, he made more statements, but that statement was the most relevant. And that's the one we want to focus on, because now, if you are a country at war and you face real sanctions, say like where everything is going to be closed off, then you will have to have a national economy to supply the people with what they need during wartime. That's primarily food, shelter, housing, fuel, and that sort of stuff, and the most necessary commodities a person needs to live and to conduct the work, to build the weapons, to go to war, basically. That's as simple as you can put it. If you don't intend to go to a full-blown war, then you don't need a national economy, because you're going to be able to have business relations, trade relations with other nations, whether it is China, Vietnam, you name it, whatever country is going to deal with it, the North Koreans, Turkey, Iran, other countries, there's always going to be someone who's going to be trading something with them. It will never come to this. So this is what he's expecting. So this statement is good for us because it indicates that they're not interested in escalating the war beyond to what they have going there at the moment. That was probably the most important thing. The other thing is what he said is that he expects that what he explained to his forum, to this convention, was that that he expects the economy to grow at an annualized rate of about 6% GDP growth, which is a lot because we had only 1.4% here. But looking at the shortfall of Western European products, which are not coming in there, that would be to be expected, that they're going to take up some production. A lot of this is going to be increased defense spending. And he said he wants to pump in another 600 billion rubles, which is really not that big. But then Russia is from a size of a country is huge, but from the population it is not as big. So this is a pretty good amount of money the government is going to pump into the next 6 to 7 years. And he explained in detail that he is expecting a labor shortage because in Russia the current unemployment rate is below 3%. The official unemployment rate is below 3%. And he said migration or immigration will not be able to compensate for this. That means he's telling the Russian entrepreneurs and industrialists to start looking at manufacturing utilizing robotics because there will be a lack of people doing the work. That already is a warning flag for anyone who is thinking about leaving, because if you have any skill you know, whatever your skill might be, and it is usable in industrial environments or in manufacturing in general, then you might be finding yourself on a list that you cannot leave the country because they will need your labor. Just keep that in mind too. So this is coming. This is the direction this is all going. Now, the reason why I mentioned this is now we have that Ukraine war still going on, and they broke through there. That is militarily not a huge deal, and it is not a surprise because the Ukraine is somewhat incapable of defending themselves without getting the support from the United States. Now, in order to understand that part more, is you have to realize this. We have a corporation here in Kansas. It's called the Koch Industrial Industries, Koch Industries. That's what they're called, and they're on everything that has to do with petroleum, oil, gasoline, refining, chemicals needed for these processes, and they're also into consumer products and all sorts of different things. And the Koch brothers, that's two of them, or was, I think one passed away a year ago or 2 years ago. They're here in Kansas. They're headquartered in central Kansas. They're a multi-billion global empire, basically. That's what they have built up with this stuff. And they own, or they have invested in several Russian petroleum oil-based chemical companies. They're not actively themselves over there in Russia, but they have invested heavily into partnerships and joint ventures and that sort of stuff. And to quite a few degree, several of these companies are state-owned by Putin's empire over there, like with Gazprom and that sort of stuff. So these people are, of course, and they're very conservative. They basically support every conservative president here in the United States, and they're right at the opposite from Biden. So these people are not interested in sending money over to the Ukraine, which gets the Russia further entangled into this war. And there's quite a few people who believe, like they do here in the United States, this is mostly the conservative right, which has a deep affection for the conservative kind of Russian people and their family-oriented values and that sort of stuff. So they're kind of aligned here. And those are the people which caused basically the delays you're seeing in the funding of the Ukraine war. Because with Biden and the Ukraine government over there, this is not in their political spectrum or something they would actively normally support. And they heavily invested into Russia itself. Not like with the Koch Industries, with the Koch brothers, it is that way, that they are invested in terms of owning partnerships or being involved in ownership of Russian companies, partial companies, and that sort of stuff. And they have pretty much a direct link. So this whole thing now, with Putin speaking there, having these people here, the right-wing conservatives, supporting Putin more or less because of their business interest in political, religious beliefs or values, whatever you want to call it. They're more on their side than they are with the Ukrainians. And for them, of course, they understand that the Ukraine should belong to Russia, and so they're not really interested in it. So they figure there's more territory Russia is going to gain, and then they're going to settle this in a peace conference, and the Ukraine is going to be divided somewhat similar to what Germany was to that extent. That is probably their end game, so to speak, in this. And this is the direction Putin is going. Now, going back to this is on how to actually, we're looking at the losses. I think the 47 Mechanized Brigade is primarily in that region right now. where defending that region where the Russians broke through, or have been breaking in through and have formed the spearhead, which is kind of blooming out like the tulip now. It's opening up and they're going to be in there to a certain extent. They kind of broke through, and we will see on how this is going to go. I said in the very beginning when this war started, when that fighting was going on there in that other city, I forgot the name of it, close to the Belarus border, with that river going through there and that lake being there, to destroy the supply lines. And this was one touchy point for the West to support the Ukraine with, and this is coming now back, biting them in their behind. Because in order to reach the Russian supply lines, you will have to attack the railroad, the infrastructure in Russia. And with that, you always have a certain degree of chance that you're also going to kill innocent Russian civilians, which no one really wants to do in that, especially from the Western side out, having weapons involved in this. And now, the reluctance first was now not farther than 60 miles or 50 whatever kilometers or miles was with the artillery shells and ATEX, now I forgot it, the long-range 300-kilometer warheads and stuff like this. But this is all very limited. What you can do is, the problem is now the attack, the counter-offensive started out of the region in Luhansk there, I think it is, which is the closest in terms of distance to Russia. That means that it's the shortest distance of supplies to the front line. They can shovel that straight through, basically. And I'm not aware on how much and what the Ukraine has actually done to effectively combat the supply routes to this. In essence, what you have to do, literally, is you have to destroy the entire railroad network of that southern area in mainland Russia, almost all the way up to Moscow, to cause such a severe damage that there's no more trains, that everything has to be moved by truck, basically. Because once you're in a situation where everything has to be moved by truck, you have the weight limits, and then weather conditions and fuel and all of this. The logistics gets real complicated. Trains are easy to put together. Trains can travel a long time, and they can get there fairly quickly without having the driver to stop and this, that, and the other thing. So none of this has obviously transpired. My primary reasoning, I would guess, or the primary reasoning for this not happening was the likelihood, by doing such attacks or destruction of the rail network in Russia, that the fear is that Russian people are going to be killed, civilians, and that would create a huge anti-Western, anti-Ukrainian sentiment, a real one, not just built up through media propaganda in Russia, but a real one. Now, so far, we have lost a lot of Russian soldiers, and a lot of them have been handicapped now. That's a very sad story, and the casualties on the other side, from the 47 Mechanized Brigade, I believe it is, they say they have been depleted to 50%, which is quite an amazing loss, in this, and they haven't been able to replenish them. And so there is fundamental questions, which are to a certain extent ethical, which, whether you want to proceed with this or not. On the other hand, is the Russians have been shelling everything and anything almost in the Ukraine. So at the cost of civilian lives, without any disregard. That is the counter side of it. Now, the only reason why the West is reluctant to do it, or to support a shelling of infrastructure in Russia, is because they're afraid to get sucked actively into this war. That's pretty much when I've probably said this. So somewhere or the other, some people who are more intelligent than I am, especially if it comes to warfare, they have to figure out a plan on how this can be accomplished. You have to stop the weapons. What we have seen here lately is with the Russians taking out the power infrastructure. That will debilitate the production facilities which can build ammunition, weapons, or what have you in the Ukraine. It will definitely hamper the effort into this. That is usually the first thing, is if you take out the grid, the electrical grid, then it's going to be very cumbersome to do anything, because you have to switch over to generator power. They need fuel. You probably could put up solar panels and photovoltaic systems and that sort of stuff in windmills. But in a reliable long-term, and then you have to carry batteries there to have power at night. So usually the generators is the simpler approach to it, but that will require fuel which they probably need on the front lines for the tanks and all of that stuff. So this is the question. Now, who can more effectively disrupt the supply lines of the other side? And then who has the better capabilities of rearmament and to restaff, to replenish the fallen soldiers, to recharge everything, basically, to rotate your reserves in and that sort of stuff. And at this point, it looks like that Russia is more organized and structured for this than the Ukraine is. I quite frankly do not understand the Ukrainian draft system for this war. There are some serious questions I would have to ask Zelensky, because he will know better of why he did or why they did the way they did it. From our German experience, I can tell you that once you get to an amount or degree of war involvement, when the war gets too far and you're too far committed into it, you basically have to throw the whole country into the war. And that is what happened in Germany. What that means is, in Germany, meant that the German men had to fight, which left the factories to produce the weapons and everything else, and the fields for food empty. So they had to revert to forced labor to get this going, to make up for the shortfall. This is when you have a mass mobilization, is where all the men usually wind up on the front lines. Here, the United States too. Here, the women stayed behind and did all the, manufacturing of all of this stuff with a few men. But the United States is a large country. They had already 160 million people, or so 180 million people at that time, when World War II came about here. So it was a little bit easier. As smaller a country is, as more difficult this becomes, because it derails everyone's life in a heartbeat. So this is something I can judge, but we would have to ask Zelensky of what is he trying to do? How can this be realistically accomplished, and how fast? Because without manpower, besides of having weapons, this is not going to go. That would be my take in it. And of course, the other question would be, how easily could be mobile ammunition plants set up, which are in a more remote or underground location, not easily reached. Basically, the organization TAT comes into mind. The Russians accused you already of being Nazis, so you might as well just go ahead and do it. because at this point it doesn't make any difference anymore. Todd went in, the organization Todd went in and built in the caves and stuff like this. They set up the manufacturing in the mountains, far from reach from any type of aircraft or missile type weapon systems. That is something you would have to fairly quickly implement to crank up the wartime production in it. On the other hand, is the Russians right now have the upper hand in this whole thing, and they probably can, if they play their cards right, they will go ahead and probably trying to move further and further towards Kiev until the day comes and Kiev falls, which we don't hope that it is going to happen. Like I said, I don't have all the answers, and I don't have a crystal ball here to look into to predict the future. But this is basically what we heard, what people are going to, or the Russian elite is going to base, the business elite is going to be basing their decisions on what they're going to do. From what Putin told them is music in every capitalist's ear. I can tell you that much. It sounds good. If it materialized that way, there's going to be a lot of rich people there in Russia on their own accord. Now, one thing as a conclusion of this, the Russian Communist Party ran at every presidential election since 1992. The best results they got was after 4 years of Boris Yeltsin. I think it was 96. They almost reached 40%. Yeltsin was at 52%. On the last election, 2018, they reached about 17-18%. In some regions, they went 22-23%, and some of them, they were like at 14-15%. In this election, they went to 5.5%. Now, this is a 13% difference in the overall country on average. And I have not heard or seen anyone that these people were, manhandled at the polling booth not to vote for the Communist Party, like the SA, the brown shirts, did back in 1932-33, when they were intimidating people in the large cities on how to vote, basically. That did not happen. So somewhere along the line, with 13% of these voters who normally vote for the Russian Communist Party, they shifted. Probably maybe 2-3% have voted for the other two candidates they were able to vote. Some of them may not even went to vote. And others, they probably voted for Putin. And why would they have done that? Was because he has the strong leadership, what they're looking for, what no longer came. It is the Stalin syndrome, if we can call it like this. I would be careful with it. Some people, some group of people, they need a strong leader for them to be able to live or to exist. And this may be just the case here too. With that, you have a good night, and I will be checking in. Ukraine, don't worry about it. Everything is over when the fat lady sings, and she hasn't gotten on the stage yet, so I wouldn't worry about things too much. It's difficult, but it's going to be okay. I'm sure about it. And with that, you have a good night.